Imagine waking to a morning where the sky is a warm, thick breath, and the trees rise like green towers, their fronds unfurling above roofs the way cathedral arches crown a city. The air tastes of damp earth and something wild. Your path to the fields is a narrow ribbon between trunks taller than any house you've known. This is the world the Bible and ancient tradition point us toward when they describe life before the flood. A world on a different scale, and one that shaped the lives of the invisible workers, the farmers, herders, midwives, porters, and craftsmen who bore the weight of everyday survival, and who, in the end, were the first to vanish beneath the waters. What was life like for those people? What did a day look like for someone who woke to feed a family, mend a roof, and keep a hearth going while giants roamed and the sky itself was changing? To answer, we cross narrative strands. The terse account in Genesis, the expanded stories in ancient Jewish tradition, and careful, cautious interpretation about what those texts imply about environment, labor, and social order. I will keep two priorities: the biblical sequence, creation, life before the flood, corruption, and the flood, and the human scale, the daily rhythms of those whose names rarely appear in the margins of Scripture. At dawn, the farmer climbs a rope ladder lashed to a trunk to reach fruit that grows in bunched layers far above the ground. Harvest is not a solitary chore, but a team operation. Steady hands below to hold the ladder, a woman at the crown to cut with a long-bladed hook, boys and girls passing down woven baskets. The yield is enormous, but so is the cost. Trees that towered like columns demanded more workers, heavier tools, and new techniques to climb, to prune, to carry. Herders drove animals that grazed on broad plains, where the grass grew knee-deep to the giants among them, meaty, slow beasts whose hooves could make the ground tremble. A porter balanced a load of woven mats and bronze tools along a causeway, sidestepping the droppings of creatures the size of small houses. These are not romanticized hardships, they are hard facts of scale. A midwife wakes before dawn to a night that never quite cools. She has delivered children small as a fist, and children who, the neighbors say in low tones, did not seem like ordinary infants. The midwife brings her oil and her simple instruments, applies a cooling herb, and tries to arrange the birthing cabin so that the mother can labor in relative privacy. Not always possible when the house is crowded with kin and when the demands of power place women within reach of rulers. Birth in that age is intimate work and a dangerous one. Newborns, quickly growing, strain household food supplies and push families into new economies, tribute, bartered labor, even migration. A craftsman keeps the fire under a small forge, tending bronze castings whose metal will become axe heads, bracelets, gates. The skills that were taught by outsiders, ledgers of alloy, techniques for hammering and soldering, charms for luring customers, transformed his trade. What was once household repair slides into mass production when the powerful demand monuments and military gear. He watches as the rhythm of his day shifts from fixing the plow to making blades. These are the invisible workers, the hands that kept food on tables and roofs over heads, the women who laughed and wept in kitchens and birthing cabins, the men whose backs carried the village's survival. They are the main characters of this reconstruction because the texts, canonical and extra-canonical, suggest their world was reshaped by forces beyond their control. To build the larger picture, we must start with environment and ecology. Genesis implies an antediluvian atmosphere unlike ours. Early chapters suggest the earth was watered in different ways. The land was tended by a mist before the rains known to us fell freely, Genesis 2:5-6. Some ancient interpreters imagined a canopy of vapor that wrapped the earth, creating a warm, stable climate and perhaps contributing to extraordinary plant and animal growth. Under such a canopy, ferns and tree ferns and towering flora could have reached monstrous proportions, and animals grew into sizes that put pressure on human settlement patterns. Pair that with a fauna that included long-necked beasts, powerful grazers, and predators that prompted communities to construct higher platforms and stronger enclosures. Farmers learned to harvest at height, to weave ladders and slings, to move in teams when cutting fruit. Herders stayed close to corrals at night, for a single careless watch could lose a flock to a prowling predator or to a collision with a grazing giant. This is not speculation invented to thrill. It is a reading of textual hints combined with the human logic of large living systems. Larger plants and animals require different labor and different social organization. But scale alone does not explain the breakdown that led to the flood. The biblical narrative, Genesis 6:1-4, describes an interaction that unsettles later interpreters. The sons of God saw the daughters of humans that they were beautiful, and they took wives for themselves, Genesis 6:2. Canonical text here is terse, factual, and elliptical. It tells us that there were men of renown, Hebrew Nephilim, often translated fallen ones or giants, and that violence and corruption increased in the earth. Genesis 6:11 puts it bluntly. Now the earth was corrupt, Hebrew shaphath, and full of violence, Hebrew hamas. The words matter. The root shachat, carries the sense to corrupt, to spoil, to destroy. Hebrew lexical note, shachat, to corrupt/destroy. Hamas, is commonly rendered violence or oppression. Hebrew lexical note, Hamas, violence/oppression. Later Jewish traditions, most famously the Book of Enoch, an extra-canonical work widely known in Second Temple Judaism, expand this moment dramatically. Enoch names a group of heavenly beings, often called the Watchers or Vigilantes, who descend to earth, teach forbidden arts, and take human wives. The Book of Enoch gives names, Shem-Hazai, also spelled Shem-Hazah or Shemi-Hazah, and Azazel among them, and details like the teaching of metallurgy, cosmetics, and astrological lore. Book of Enoch, extra-canonical tradition. It says they taught the cutting of roots and the making of swords and the smoothing of mirrors, images that scholars read as shorthand for new technologies and social changes. We must treat those accounts carefully. Genesis is scripture. Enoch is an ancient tradition that preserved a community's way of explaining moral catastrophe. Enoch's story is not canonical for most Christian traditions, but it is invaluable for reconstructing how ancient people understood the origins of dangerous knowledge and the social changes that followed. When we bring Enoch into conversation with Genesis, we do so as reconstruction, not as doctrinal addition. In that conversation, the Watchers are the agents who accelerate technological and cultural shifts that dramatically affect labor. Imagine the craftsman again. Before, his forge made nails and tools for neighbors. After the Watchers' teaching spread, forges produce weapons and ornament on a scale demanded by local lords. Bronze techniques bloom into workshops, workshops bloom into foundries. The craftsman's day extends later. The pile of raw material grows, and his labor becomes more hazardous and more coercive. Tribute collectors, men backed by armed giants or by rulers who command the workforce, come to his door with lists and threats. The invisible workers are pressed into construction gangs, hauling stone and bronze under banners that represent someone else's prestige. The knowledge the Watchers supposedly introduce includes a startling range: metallurgy and forging, the use of cosmetics and dyes, the practice of what the Greek text later called pharmakia, charms, drugs, and ritual sorcery, and astrological lore used to cast omens. Each of these altered social relations. Metalwork made stronger weapons and heavier tools. With stronger weapons, elites could press labor more forcefully. Cosmetics and ornaments changed social signaling. Beauty became a commodity and a lever of power, a way elites could mark status and demand service. Pharmakia, as the text put it, introduced compounds and practices that could alter perceptions, bind loyalties, or numb conscience. Astronomy offered elites a language to claim divine favor and to plan campaigns and harvests with new assertiveness. Again, these are interpretive patterns drawn from how the stories line up. The Book of Enoch, extra-canonical tradition, presents a narrative where the Watcher's gifts are directly linked to social decay. Genesis suggests that human wickedness increases until God decides to act. Together, they give us a model. Powerful new techniques and symbolic systems arrive quickly, and a society that lacks the checks to steward them turns technology into coercion. From the vantage of the invisible worker, the consequences are tangible and painful. Tribute takes grain from the pit and herds from the fold. Forced conscription pulls able hands from fields at crucial planting or harvest times. A village already organized around high-stakes coordination for harvesting tall fruit and moving heavy loads now feels the squeeze. Food becomes less reliable as resources are diverted to feed fast-growing populations and the appetites of the giants. There are birth stories told in the marketplaces. Tales of babies who grew so fast that midwives murmured about unusual bones and appetites. The Nephilim, recorded in Genesis as men of renown, Nephilim, are then seen in extra-biblical accounts as offspring of the Watchers and human women, beings who grew into strength and size at costs to local subsistence. Here a micro-vignette. A midwife named Ada pulls a woven gnat beneath a laboring woman whose belly seems already larger than it should be. Ada's hands know the ways of herbs and compression and the old chants that soothe a mother. The newborn is heavy, startlingly so. The household rejoices, then counts the ration pots. The father, thin from long drives to distant pastures, braces himself. Already the neighbors whisper about how the landlord's men have taken more of the grain this season. For Ada, each birth is both a miracle and a calculation. A new mouth, a new set of hands, a new drain on the small reserves that keep a family alive through lean months. Her care is both tender and anxious. Labor, in other words, is never merely technical. It is moral arithmetic. The social texture darkens as the Nephilim mature and elites shape their power around these new bodies. Towers and gates rise to showcase wealth. Laborers hammer bronze into elaborate doors whose weight is a public sign of investment. The porter who once ferried food between tents now hauls stone blocks for palatial facades. Songs change. The shepherds who used to whistle soft laments to call sheep now learn war chant rhythms as conscripts march in iron. Rituals multiply. The Book of Jubilees and other ancient traditions mention cultic practices and new rites that accompanied this social upheaval. Jubilees, extra-canonical tradition. Again, these traditions aim to explain why human imagery is so entangled with violence in the older texts. Two lexical ideas help us summarize the theological claim Genesis offers. All flesh was corrupted, and the earth was full of violence. The Hebrew verb shachath, to corrupt, spoil, or destroy, suggests damage that goes beyond individual wickedness to the structures of life. Another Hebrew root, hamas, points to violent oppression that becomes systemic. When the narrator of Genesis says, all flesh was corrupted, Genesis 6:12, the scope is not only moral, it is ecological and communal. Food systems, family networks, trust economies, the informal safety nets that invisible workers relied upon, fray. For communities built on interdependence and cooperation, the entrance of coercive power and rapidly spreading technologies can be swift and devastating. Some modern scholars and commentators use metaphors like contamination or even draw analogies to genetic mixing when they discuss the Nephilim and the Watchers. We must be careful. The ancient texts do not provide modern biological descriptions, and calling what the Watchers did genetic engineering would be anachronistic. A safer way to say it is this: The texts describe a boundary violation between heavenly beings and human life, between established ways of making kin and a new hybridization of social categories. Readers through history have analogized that to biological mixing because the stories emphasize unexpected physicality, giants, rapid growth, unusual appetites. These are interpretive analogies, not scientific claims. On the ground, invisible workers experienced the consequences in practical terms. Food shortages increased because a larger population, including giants, consumed a disproportionate share of resources. Labor was redirected toward palaces and weapons, not fields and canals. The rhythm of care, midwifery, bread baking, tending animals became precarious. Communities adapted with makeshift solutions, communal granaries, night watches, secret barter networks. But these fixes had limits. An example of adaptation and strain. A small farming village pooled wagons and men to harvest before a landlord's men could take the stores. Women took shifts pounding grain into flour, both to save time and to hide how much they had stored. In one such night, a band of great hunters, rumored to be the offspring of the Nephilim, passed near the granary, and the watchmen had to scare them off with torches and noise. The granary survived. The next autumn, the village had less seed to sow. Little adaptive victories accumulated into long-term decline. The cultural picture darkens further when we look at the social functions of music, cosmetics, and pharmakeia. The Book of Enoch lists these as among the spoils the watchers taught humanity. Instruments of song and poetry. Jubal is named in Genesis as father of all who play the lyre, Genesis 4:21. Embellishments of the body, and compendia of bitter herbs and compounds used in rites, compare Genesis 4:21, Book of Enoch, extra-canonical tradition. In small communities, music and ritual have cohesion-building functions. But when leveraged by elites, they become tools of distraction, of elevation of status, or of control. In a world where the elites drum the loudest, ordinary songs get drowned, and public spaces become stages for displays of power. At the root of the flood narrative is a deep concern about order. Genesis presents the flood as God's response to the breakdown of created harmony. The flood acts as a reset, a means by which the patterns of life can be restored. The mechanics in Genesis are straightforward. God sees the earth corrupt, God decides to bring a flood, and Noah, found righteous, is instructed to build an ark and preserve a remnant, Genesis 6:9. The Book of Enoch and Jubilees cast the antecedent causes in more detailed mythic terms: watchers, teaching, hybrid offspring. But the theological core remains. Something had gone terribly wrong in the relations among heaven, earth, and human life, and a radical intervention followed. To frame this as an ecological process helps us translate the ancient narrative into human terms. Think of social and environmental systems as networks of interdependence. When one node, for instance, trustworthy exchange and household subsistence, collapses because labor is diverted, the whole system feels the strain. When technology accelerates and few guardrails exist, social harm spread faster. The texts describe a kind of contagion, a spread of violence, of appetite, of misuse. The flood, then, is depicted as a comprehensive remedy, a purge in the literal sense of washing, meant not merely to punish but to restore equilibrium. Now picture the moment of collapse. For the invisible workers, it is both ordinary and extraordinary. The morning may begin like any other. Fires lit, children sent to sweep the courtyard, goats let out. Then the sky changes. If a vapor canopy had provided a steady climate for generations, its failure would be cataclysmic. In the Genesis account, the flood is unleashed when the fountains of the great deep burst forth and the windows of heaven were opened, Genesis 7:11. That language evokes subterranean waters and a sky unlatched, an upheaval of the earth's boundaries.
For workers, walls that once kept out predators will fail before water that finds every seam. Boats and woven floats had been rare tools of the poor. Suddenly, mobility becomes survival skill. Imagine a porter on a city causeway noticing a thin, persistent drizzle that is not the soft mist of mornings, but a heavier, cold rain. He runs to the market and finds the roads already slick. Neighbors shout, "The springs are rising." The craftsman who had spent weeks soldering a gate abandoned his metalwork and helps his family load goats onto a cart. In the chaos, palaces that once displayed power become traps. Their heavy doors hold in the weight of the water and the cries of those inside.
Small boats and primitive rafts, the kinds of crafts a household might build, become the practical means of escape for those who can reach them. Noah's Ark, in the biblical narrative, is built as a refuge for a chosen remnant. It is both a vessel and a theological symbol of preservation. How do we interpret the fate of the invisible workers in that catastrophic moment? Some of them are swept away. Some survive in boats. Some are part of the remnant that continues. The biblical account focuses on Noah's family as the nucleus of the new human story. That focus risks obscuring millions of unnamed lives. Yet the final chapters of Genesis and the survivor narratives in later tradition are not indifferent to the personal tragedies. The flood story preserves grief as well as salvation. It commemorates both loss and the possibility of a renewed covenant. There are hard ethical lessons in that intersection of technology and social power. The ancient narratives teach that knowledge without wisdom can be dangerous. A craftsman taught how to alloy bronze without an ethic of use will be pressed by those with appetite into making weapons rather than plows. A healer taught potent herbs without accountability can turn remedies into instruments of control. The invisible workers are thereby the moral barometer. Their plight shows whether a society can channel innovation for common flourishing or whether it will redirect labor into domination. We must also remember the limits of our reconstruction. When we translate phrases like the sons of God or Nephilim, we are interpreting ancient categories that meant different things to different communities. The Book of Enoch gives names and motives. Jubilees reshapes chronology. Genesis keeps the account terse and the theological center focused on God's judgment and mercy. Any full reading should acknowledge that other ancient readers offered other maps of meaning. My aim here is to assemble a plausible human-scale picture built from these overlapping narratives, not to claim an exhaustive historical reconstruction. Before we close, return one last time to three faces among the invisible workers: the farmer, the midwife, the porter-carpenter. The farmer, call him Eli, rises before the vapors thin. He and his family haul woven baskets through arcs of fronds and coordinated ropes, working in teams to bring down fruit. He mends baskets with plant fiber and tends to pruning wounds on trees as if tending elder kin. When the watcher's knowledge arrives, Eli finds the market flooded with new goods. Bronze plows that promise to cut more quickly but cost much more, levy demands for grain in exchange for labor, and new taxes. Eli's sleep grows thinner as he counts seed sacks. The midwife, Ada, works with hands trained by older women. She uses cooling leaves and songs to coax a child into the world. When the Nephilim arrive, the births she attends become more complicated. Children who grow fast push mothers to the edge of food reserves. Their growth becomes rumor. Ada threads her solace through each small life she touches, creating a network of care that is both fragile and fierce. The porter-carpenter, Micah, splits his time moving loads between tents and the city palaces. When Azazel and others in the Enoch narrative share the arts of bronze and iron, his skills become demanded by men of power. He learns to cast bigger plates and construct heavier gates, but his days lengthen and his family sees him less. Micah is pragmatic. He hammers to survive. But he also watches the social order change and wonders what kind of world his children will inherit. All three reflect the paradox of pre-flood life: intense productivity and skillfulness coupled with rising precarity. Many of their daily innovations, better tools, improved hauling techniques, new crops, could have been gifts for survival. Yet, when wrapped in unchecked power dynamics, the same techniques become levers for extraction. When the flood comes, those levers break. The social networks that once structured labor collapse almost overnight. The Ark narrative preserves a theological argument that human misrule had reached a point necessitating a reset. This is a tragic conclusion for the invisible workers, who are both victims and witnesses. Their work, their songs, their griefs are washed into memory, and later stories preserve fragments. The names of a few, the outline of a catastrophe, and the moral plea to steward knowledge with wisdom. Why does this matter to us now? The ancient tale is not simply a dramatic legend. It is, in part, a reflection on how societies cope with rapid change and the responsibilities that come with technical knowledge. The invisible workers remind us that progress can foreclose the very lives it claims to enrich when it is concentrated in the hands of a few. The story demands humility about how we deploy power, care for the vulnerable, and hold innovation to account. If you want a deeper dive into how the Book of Enoch narrates the Watchers and what those accounts add to Genesis, click the video linked on screen now. It unpacks names, motives, and the archaeological conversation around these traditions. To end where we began, life for the invisible workers before the flood was complicated, magnificent at times, brutally hard at others. It was governed by a strange mix of abundance and strain. Extraordinary plant and animal sizes shaping labor practices, new technologies transforming trades, and social dynamics that turned innovation into instruments of oppression. The ancients described these changes in terms that mixed the cosmic and the intimate. He who taught metallurgy also taught what it meant for families to be called upon for tribute. He who taught cosmetics reshaped desire and status. The children of those unions became both marvels and drains on survival. The final image is not only of waters rising and palaces sinking, but of a world where the kindnesses of daily labor, shared bread, midwives' songs, hand-steadying ladders, are what keeps human communities tethered to one another. Those are the threads the flood severs, and the threads Noah's Ark seeks to tie together again. If this reconstruction of invisible lives moved you, subscribe for the next episode where we examine the Ark's design and who may have been saved, and share this video to keep these forgotten voices alive. For sources, see Genesis 6 through 9, Genesis 2 for pre-rain imagery, the Book of Enoch and Jubilees as ancient extra-canonical traditions that expand the story, and Hebrew lexical notes for words like shachath, shachath to corrupt/destroy, and Hamas, violence/oppression, used as interpretive keys. Some vocabulary in later transcriptions appears in variant forms, names like Shemhazai/Shemihaza/Shemihaza, and where I used such names, I followed the most common English renderings while noting variant spellings in scholarly editions. Thank you for listening to the stories of the unseen many, the workers whose daily lives, work, and losses are central to understanding why the ancient world remembers the flood the way it does.